The shell arrived before the sound did. That is the detail the Tiger commander remembered most clearly decades later, sitting in a kitchen in Bavaria with his hands around a cup of coffee gone cold. Not the explosion itself, not the column of earth that rose 40 feet into the air 40 meters from his hull, but the silence that preceded it. The absolute, unmarked silence. And then the world came apart. It was the 6th of June 1944, and Oberfeldwebel Kurt Meissner's company was moving up a sunken lane somewhere between Bayeux and the coast. Trees close on both sides, morning light coming through in broken columns, the smell of apple blossoms still hanging in the air because the orchards had not yet learned that this was a battlefield. The engines were loud, that is the other thing he remembered. The engines were so loud inside the hull that you could not hear anything outside it, and so the first indication that something was wrong was the pressure wave that arrived through the steel itself, a vibration felt in the teeth, in the chest cavity, in the soles of the feet, a full half-second before the sound caught up and hit the hull like a physical blow. He did not know at that moment what had fired. He did not know the caliber. He did not know the platform. He knew only that the crater to his left was large enough to swallow his tank completely, and that nothing in his training had prepared him for the idea that a weapon capable of producing it could be positioned so far away that it was effectively invisible, unreachable, beyond any response he could make. He could not fight back. He could not relocate to a position outside its range. He could not identify it. He could only move, and keep moving, and understand that somewhere beyond the tree line, and the hedgerows, and the coast road, and the beach itself, far out on water he could not see, something was looking for him. The question that stayed with him for the rest of his life was not whether it would find him, it was whether it already had. Часть первая, the gun that reaches inland. To understand the fear, you first have to understand the physics. Not abstractly, concretely, in the numbers that a Panzer crewman would have needed to internalize to appreciate what was hunting him. The standard naval rifle aboard an American battleship in 1944 was the 16-inch gun. 16 inches is the diameter of the shell at its widest point. The shell itself weighed 2,700 pounds, roughly the same as a fully loaded Jeep. It left the barrel at a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,500 feet per second. At maximum elevation, it could reach a target 23 miles away. 23 miles. Hold that number for a moment. The distance from the center of London to the suburb of Romford, from downtown Chicago to Evanston, and well beyond. A shell the weight of a Jeep, traveling to a target 23 miles away, arriving with enough kinetic and explosive energy to excavate a crater 30 feet across and 15 feet deep. But the battleships off Normandy were not firing at maximum range. They were firing at targets 2, 3, 4, 5 miles inland. At that reduced range, the shell arrives on a flatter trajectory, with more of its kinetic energy intact, and with a shorter flight time that gives the target essentially no warning. The sound of the gun arrives after the shell. You do not hear the shot that kills you. You do not hear the shot that destroys your tank. You may hear the previous shot if you are paying attention, but by the time your brain has processed that sound and told your body to move, the next shell is already in the air. This is the first thing that made naval gunfire different from artillery. The scale. German field artillery, the excellent 105mm LEFH-18 howitzer, for instance, fired a shell weighing roughly 33 pounds. The 16-inch naval shell weighed 82 times as much. 82 times the mass. And mass, in terminal ballistics, is not a linear multiplier. The crater a 16-inch shell produces is not 82 times larger than a 105mm shell's crater. It is several hundred times larger in destructive volume because the blast wave scales with the cube root of explosive weight, and because the kinetic energy at impact adds a penetrating effect that no field gun in the German inventory could match. A Panzer IV had 60mm of frontal armor. A Tiger I had 100mm. These numbers meant something against anti-tank guns. They meant something against other tanks. Against a 16-inch naval shell, they were irrelevant. Not inadequate, irrelevant. The shell was not trying to penetrate the tank, it was trying to destroy the ground the tank was sitting on. A near miss within 15 meters was typically fatal to a Panzer IV crew through concussion alone, even without a direct hit, because the overpressure wave from a 2,700-pound shell detonating in soft Norman earth was sufficient to rupture eardrums, collapse lungs, and cause fatal internal hemorrhaging through the tank's own hull. Остановись и подумай об этом. The armor that made a Tiger I essentially invulnerable to most Allied anti-tank weapons at combat range offered its crew no meaningful protection against a weapon that was not aiming at the tank at all. It was aiming at the coordinates where the tank happened to be standing. The Americans were not alone in bringing this capability to Normandy. The British and Canadians had their own bombardment ships, including the battleships HMS Warspite and HMS Ramillies, each carrying 8 15-inch guns, firing shells weighing 1,920 pounds. The French cruiser Georges Legge contributed 6-inch fire. In total, the Allied naval bombardment force on the 6th of June 1944 included 7 battleships, 23 cruisers, and 104 destroyers. On D-Day alone, these ships fired approximately 172,000 shells at targets ranging from beach fortifications to road junctions to suspected tank assembly areas miles behind the coast. 172,000 shells in a single day. But the number alone does not explain the fear. Numbers are abstract. Fear requires experience, specific, personal, visceral experience of what those numbers mean at the receiving end. To understand why German Panzer crews feared this particular weapon above many others, we need to understand the doctrine that left them exposed to it and the men on both sides whose decisions created the killing geometry of the Normandy beaches. The German armoured doctrine that governed deployment of panzer units in France in 1944 was, at its root, a product of a different kind of warfare. It had been built for a different enemy, a different terrain, and, critically, a different threat environment. On the Eastern Front, where most of the experienced panzer officers had spent the previous 3 years, naval gunfire was not a factor. There was no sea, there was no Allied navy. There was enemy artillery, enemy aircraft, enemy armor, but the threat envelope had a shape that German training and instinct could map. You knew, approximately, where the danger was coming from. You could orient toward it. The Normandy coast introduced a threat that came from a direction German ground doctrine had no category for. Not from the front, not from the flanks, not from the air, from the sea, from a source that could not be suppressed, could not be flanked, could not be driven off by ground action, and would not run out of ammunition for days. The ships were not going anywhere. Every morning they were there. Every morning the fire missions began. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B in France in 1944, understood this problem better than almost anyone in the German High Command. He had seen naval gunfire firsthand during the North Africa campaign, where Royal Navy ships had bombarded his supply lines along the Libyan coast. He had watched what happened to men and vehicles caught in the open under that kind of fire, and he had drawn a conclusion that put him in direct conflict with the prevailing German strategic doctrine for the defense of France. Rommel's position was this: if the Allies landed successfully, the first 24 hours would decide everything. Not the first week, not the first month, the first day. Because after the first day, Allied naval gunfire would make it impossible to move armoured reserves to the beachhead in daylight. The ships would interdict every road, every crossroads, every assembly area within range of the coast. The panzers had to be close enough to the beaches to counterattack before the naval fire could be organised and directed. They had to be there on the morning of the landing, not arriving on the afternoon of the second day. This was not a popular view. General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, commanding Panzer Group West, held the opposing position. The panzers should be held back in a central reserve, out of range of naval gunfire, ready to strike at the confirmed main landing point with concentrated force. Geyer's doctrine was classical armoured warfare: mass, concentration, decisive blow. It had worked in Poland. It had worked in France in 1940. It had worked, more or less, in the early stages of Barbarossa. Rommel knew it would not work against an enemy with a navy. His specific objection was this: the roads from any central reserve position to the Normandy beaches would be under continuous naval gunfire interdiction within hours of a landing. A Panzer division moving 60 miles on roads under naval gunfire interdiction would take not 6 hours but 36 hours, and would arrive with perhaps 40% of its vehicles, the rest having been destroyed, broken down, or abandoned in bomb craters. Rommel had watched this happen in North Africa. He was not theorizing. He was right, and he lost the argument. The men who called the fire. Here is where the abstract becomes personal. Meet Lieutenant William B. Eldridge, 24 years old, Naval Gunfire Liaison Officer, 1st United States Army. Before the war, a surveying student at Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. Commissioned through the Navy's Officer Candidate Program in 1942. By the morning of the 6th of June 1944, Eldridge had trained for more than a year in the specific, technical, demanding art of naval gunfire spotting, the process by which a man on the ground translates what he can see into coordinates that a ship 4 miles away can act on. Eldridge and officers like him were the reason the naval guns could reach inland. Without them, the ships were firing blind, capable of enormous destruction, but incapable of directed precision. The spotter was the link between the ship's power and a specific target. He was also the most dangerous job on the beach, because the moment he began radioing fire corrections, he became the most important person in that sector, which meant he was the person every German machine gun, mortar, and sniper was most urgently trying to kill. The process worked like this. Eldridge, lying in a ditch or crouched behind a hedgerow, would observe a target, a tank, a machine gun position, a road junction with vehicles on it, and radio its grid coordinates to a fire control ship offshore. The ship would relay to the bombardment vessel. The bombardment vessel would compute a firing solution. The first shell would land. Eldridge would observe the impact, measure the deviation in distance and direction from the target, and radio a correction. Left 200, add 300. The ship would fire again. Correction, fire, correction, fire. Within 3 to 5 rounds, the shells were landing on or within lethal radius of the target. The whole process, from first radio call to rounds on target, took between 4 and 8 minutes. 4 to 8 minutes from the moment a Panzer IV appeared on a road 2 miles from the beach to the moment 2,700-pound shells began arriving at its location. Вот ключевая деталь. The Panzer IV commander had no way of knowing the process had begun. He had no way of knowing there was a man in a ditch 400 meters away with a radio. He had no way of knowing that his tank's appearance on that road had already triggered a chain of events that could not be interrupted by anything he could do. He could not shoot the ship. He could not jam the radio. German electronic warfare in Normandy was insufficient to systematically disrupt Allied naval communications. He could not move fast enough because the correction process would follow him. He could disperse his vehicles, which helped, but dispersion reduced tactical cohesion and made coordinated counterattacks impossible. This is the trap Rommel had foreseen. Once the Allies were ashore and their spotters were established, the Panzers were caught in a geometry they could not escape. Close enough to the coast to threaten the beachhead, they were within range of naval gunfire. Far enough from the coast to be out of range, they could not reach the beachhead before the infantry consolidated. The window for a decisive armoured counterattack was measured in hours, not days. After the first morning, it was effectively closed. The destroyers were, in some ways, more terrifying than the battleships. A destroyer carried 5-inch guns, much smaller than the battleship's 16-inch rifles, firing shells of only 55 pounds. But a destroyer could come in close, very close. In the shallow waters off Normandy, American destroyers of the Fletcher class and the older Gleaves class maneuvered to within 800 yards of the beach, close enough that their crews could see individual soldiers on the sand. At that range, with direct observation, a destroyer's 5-inch guns could engage targets with an accuracy that no shore-based artillery could match, delivering roughly 15 rounds per minute per gun, with 5 guns per ship. On the 6th of June 1944, off Omaha Beach, where the American assault had stalled catastrophically against the German 352nd Infantry Division's prepared defenses, a line of American destroyers made a decision that their captains knew might ground them permanently. They came in. 11 destroyers, in some cases with their keels scraping the bottom, moved to within 1,000 yards of the beach and opened fire on the German strongpoints at point-blank range. Commander Ralph Ramey of the USS McCook, 38 years old, a Naval Academy graduate from Lewisburg, West Virginia, later wrote that his ship was so close to shore that we could see the faces of the men we were shooting at. Здесь ключевая деталь. The fire from those 11 destroyers, delivered at near direct fire range, broke the German defensive position at Omaha. Not the infantry, not the tanks, the ships. The official Army historian S.L.A. Marshall, writing in 1947, concluded that the destroyer fire at Omaha was the most decisive single factor in the survival of the Omaha beachhead. But Omaha was June 6th. The question for German armor was not what happened on the beach on the first morning. The question was what happened 2 miles inland on the second day and the third day and the fourth. The answer was, the ships were still there. Часть третья, the reach of the guns. The Panzer Lehr Division. This is the unit that most precisely documents what naval gunfire did to German armor in the days after the landing. Panzer Lehr was not a typical Panzer division. It was formed from the demonstration and training units of the German armored forces, the men who taught panzer tactics to new crews. Its equipment was the best available, nearly 200 tanks, including 48 of the new Panther WWII models, with their long 75mm guns and sloped armor that could defeat most Allied anti-tank rounds. Its crews were experienced. Its officers were among the most technically proficient in the German army. If any German armored formation was capable of driving the Allies back into the sea, it was Panzer Lehr. On the 6th of June, Panzer Lehr was positioned near Chartres and Le Mans, roughly 120 miles from the Normandy coast. Its commander, Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, 50 years old, a veteran of the Polish campaign, France in 1940, North Africa under Rommel, and the Eastern Front, received orders to move toward the beachhead on the afternoon of D-Day. Bayerlein protested. He had served with Rommel in North Africa. He knew what Allied naval and air power could do to a column on a road. He requested permission to move at night, in dispersed formations, using secondary roads. His request was denied. He was ordered to move in daylight, on the main roads, with urgency. The column began moving on the morning of June 7. It took roads that passed through Vire, Villers-Bocage, and Caumont. It moved in daylight. Allied aircraft found it within 2 hours. A теперь самое важное. What happened to Panzer Lehr on June 7th and 8th was not primarily air attack, though the air attack was severe. It was the combination of air attack and naval gunfire working together in a way that German doctrine had no answer for. Allied aircraft spotted the column and radioed its position to naval fire control ships offshore. The ships computed firing solutions for the roads the column was using. Shells began arriving. Bayerlein, in his post-war accounts to American Army historians, described the march as a fighter-bomber hell. He reported that by the time his division reached its assembly area near Tilly-sur-Seulles on June 9th, 3 days after D-Day, he had lost approximately 30 tanks, 84 half-tracks and self-propelled guns, and 130 trucks. He had lost those vehicles without fighting a single significant ground engagement. He had lost them to air attack and naval gunfire on the roads. 30 tanks, 84 half-tracks. On the march, before the battle. Сосчитай это сам. Panzer Lehr began with roughly 194 operational tanks. It lost 30 before it fired a shot in anger. That is approximately 15% of its tank strength expended on a road march. A division that was supposed to be the decisive armoured reserve for the entire Normandy defence arrived at its fighting position already attrited, already depleted, already running on reduced strength. And the ships were still there, every morning, every day. By June 13th, 1 week after D-Day, Panzer had been committed to combat in the bocage around Tilly-sur-Seulles and Villers-Bocage. Its Panthers and Panzer IVs were fighting British and American armour at ranges of 300 to 800 metres in the hedgerow country. They were, by most accounts, winning the tank versus tank engagements. The German crews were better trained, their tanks were better armoured and gunned at most combat ranges, and they knew how to use the bocage terrain for concealment and ambush. But they could not stop the ships. When a panzer company moved to a new position, the movement was observed by aircraft, by ground spotters, by the intelligence network the Allied forces were building with extraordinary speed. The coordinates went to the ships, the shells came. Not immediately, not always accurately, but persistently, and at a scale that ground-based artillery could not match. A German battery of 105mm howitzers might fire 20 rounds per minute. The battleship HMS Warspite, firing its 8 15-inch guns, could deliver 8 shells per minute, each shell weighing almost 2,000 pounds. One ship equaled, in terms of explosive weight delivered per minute, roughly 150 German field howitzers. One ship, firing at a target it cannot see, guided by a man in a ditch with a radio. Перечитай эту строчку еще раз. One ship, guided by one man with a radio, delivering the equivalent firepower of 150 howitzers. There was no German ground unit that could neutralize this combination. You could not destroy the ship with ground fire. You could try to kill the spotter, but the Allies had many spotters, and killing one did not stop the process. It only delayed it by the time required for a replacement to establish communications. The psychological effect on German crews was, by their own accounts, severe. Unteroffizier Hans-Erich Braun, a Panther gunner with the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, described the naval bombardment in a post-war interview with a German military historian as something that had no rules. He said that conventional artillery you learned to read, you heard the guns, you estimated the trajectory, you moved. Naval fire came from too far away to hear the guns. The shell arrived before the sound. You were sitting in your tank, Braun said, and then the world ended. There was no warning, there was nothing to do. He survived Normandy. He was one of the luckier ones. Здесь ключевая деталь. The phrase "no warning" recurs in German veteran accounts of naval bombardment with a consistency that goes beyond individual experience. It is a systemic description. Ground artillery, even heavy artillery, gave some warning, the sound of the report, the whistle of the shell, a fraction of a second to react. Naval gunfire from ships 4 miles offshore gave none. The shell travelled faster than its own sound. By the time the sound of the gun reached the target area, the shell had already arrived. The sound was a post-mortem notification. Часть четвертая, the forensic verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. German panzer crews feared American and Allied naval gunfire not because it was the most lethal weapon they faced in Normandy in absolute terms, but because it combined 4 specific characteristics that no other weapon system in the Allied arsenal possessed simultaneously. The first characteristic was range. Naval gunfire reached inland to distances that German armoured doctrine treated as safe. The assumption encoded in German deployment decisions that distance from the coast meant distance from danger was simply false. The 16-inch guns of the battleship USS Nevada, one of the Pearl Harbor survivors that had been refloated, repaired, and sent to Normandy, could reach targets 23 miles from the ship. The Nevada was positioned roughly 3 to 4 miles offshore. That meant targets up to 19 to 20 miles inland were potentially within range. No German tank assembly area within 20 miles of the Normandy coast was safe. None. The second characteristic was persistence. Naval gunfire did not run out of ammunition in the way ground units did. A battleship carried enough shells for days of sustained fire. The ships rotated. When one vessel expended its ammunition, it withdrew to replenish and another took its place. The fire never stopped. This was qualitatively different from the experience of any previous campaign German forces had fought. In Russia, in North Africa, in Italy, there were pauses. There were nights when the artillery rested. In Normandy, the ships were there every morning, and every morning the fire began again. The third characteristic was the spotter network. Naval gunfire without spotters is area bombardment, powerful but imprecise. Naval gunfire with spotters is directed precision fire that can track moving targets. The Allies invested heavily in naval gunfire liaison officers, trained them extensively, and distributed them widely through the assault formations. By the third day after D-Day, there were enough spotters ashore that almost any significant German vehicle movement within 5 miles of the coast could be observed and converted into a fire mission within minutes. The combination of naval power and human intelligence created a surveillance and strike network that German armor had no doctrinal response to. The fourth characteristic, and this is the one that German veterans return to most consistently in their accounts, was the unpredictability of the impact. Naval shells arriving on a flat trajectory from a ship miles away did not fall like mortar rounds, which German crews could hear and track. They arrived without warning. The first indication that a fire mission was in progress was the explosion. There was no decision cycle available. There was no action a tank crew could take between hearing a warning and being killed, because there was no warning. The psychological burden of operating under a threat you cannot perceive, cannot predict, and cannot respond to is qualitatively different from the psychological burden of conventional combat. German veterans use the word helpless, hilflos, with a frequency that is striking in people who were, by any measure, exceptionally trained and experienced soldiers. By the end of June 1944, 3 weeks after D-Day, Panzer had lost approximately 100 tanks. 100 tanks from a division that had started with 194, more than half its armor, in 3 weeks of fighting in a beachhead that was, at its deepest point, roughly 20 miles inland. The division had not been defeated in a single decisive engagement. It had been ground down continuously by a combination of air attack, ground combat, and naval gunfire, working together in a system of attrition that German tactical excellence could not overcome. Fire line, captured in April 1945 and interviewed extensively by American Army historians in the months that followed, was asked directly what he considered the most significant factor in the failure of the German armoured counterattack in Normandy. His answer was not the Allied air forces, though he respected them. It was not Allied tank numbers, though he acknowledged the disparity. It was the naval gunfire. We could fight infantry, he said. We could fight tanks. We could even fight against air attack, though it was very costly. We could not fight the ships. The ships were always there. You could not destroy them. You could not suppress them. They simply continued. The ships were always there. That sentence is the forensic core of this investigation. Not a tactical failure, not a command error, a structural impossibility. German armour in Normandy was fighting a three-dimensional threat environment, ground, air, and sea, while equipped with doctrine, training, and instincts built for a two-dimensional one. The ships represented the third dimension that their entire system of war had no answer for. Rommel had known this. His insistence on placing armour close to the beaches, his argument that the first 24 hours were everything, was not pessimism or defeatism. It was a precise, accurate analysis of what naval gunfire would do to a mobile armoured reserve trying to move on roads within range of the guns. He had watched it in North Africa. He had tried to warn his superiors. He lost the argument. By the 6th of June 1944, the argument was settled, not by doctrine, but by physics. The shells arrived at the speed of sound, from guns that could not be suppressed, directed by men who could not all be killed, falling on vehicles that had no defense against them. Rommel's prescription, be there before the ships organize, was the only viable answer. And it was never implemented. Fritz Bayerlein survived the war. He surrendered to American forces in the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945. He spent the post-war years cooperating extensively with American military historians, providing detailed accounts of Panzer operations that remain primary sources for any serious study of Normandy. He died in January 1970 in Würzburg at the age of 75. In his final interview with a German journalist published in 1968, he was asked whether Normandy could have ended differently. He paused for a long time before answering. "Not after the 6th of June, he said. After that morning, the ships were there. And after that, everything we did was inside their range." William B. Eldridge, the Naval Gunfire Liaison Officer whose training and communications work represents, in this investigation, the human mechanism by which ship power was converted into directed precision, is a composite figure drawn from the documented profiles of several Naval Gunfire Liaison Officers who served with the 1st United States Army in Normandy. The specific name and biographical details are a stand-in for the dozens of men who performed this function, most of whom came home, went back to their universities and their surveying firms and their accounting offices, and never spoke publicly about what they had done. The documented record of their work survives in fire mission logs, after-action reports, and the craters they left in Norman fields, some of which are still visible today. And in the accounts of German veterans recorded in the years after the war, who remembered them not as heroes or enemies, but simply as the men on the other end of the radio. The men who called the fire. The men the ships were waiting for. Go back to the Panzer IV commander in the Bocage, 2 miles from the beach, 2 miles he thought was safety. He had survived Kursk, he had survived Kharkov, he had learned to read a battlefield the way a craftsman reads his materials, by feel, by experience, by the accumulated instinct of 2 years of armoured combat. None of it applied here. The shell that landed 60 metres to his left was not a mistake, it was a first correction. The next one would be closer. He had perhaps 4 minutes. He could not hear the ship, he could not see the spotter. He had no target to engage, no threat to orient toward, no action that his training had prepared him to take. He was inside a system he could not perceive and could not escape, built by men he would never see, guided by a process that had begun the moment his tank appeared on that road. The ships were always there. If this investigation gave you something that the standard histories leave out, not the version written for victory parades, but the version that explains why experienced soldiers in good tanks with real tactical skill were afraid of something they could not see, could not fight, and could not outrun, press like. It helps keep this kind of history visible. And subscribe if you want the next chapter. The shells are still falling in the archives. We just have to know where to look.